Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the, what is this, March? It's already March, can't believe it. March 8th meeting of the Policy and Innovation Committee for SACOG. Will everybody please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everybody. We'll go ahead and do our roll call.
Yes, and as you heard, the meeting is being recorded. If you would like to make a public comment, please use the raise your hand feature in Zoom. If you are participating telephonically, please press *9. Directors Bernasconi?
Here.
Burris?
Present.
Frerichs?
Here.
Gog? Absent. Lozano?
Here.
Middleton?
Here.
Ballard?
Here.
Thomas? Absent. Vice Chair Kozlowski?
Here.
And Chair Saragosa?
Here.
Thank you.
Okay. This is time for any public communication. Any person wishing to address the committee on an item that is not on the agenda. Do we have any public comments this morning?
We do not currently have any public comment.
Okay, great. Then we will go ahead and then move on to the consent items and approve the minutes of the February 8th meeting.
So moved. Ballard. Second.
All right, so we have a first from Tom, and I didn't catch the second there.
Lozano.
Lozano, okay. Any other comments on consent calendar? All right, seeing none, roll call, please.
Yeah, Directors Bernasconi?
Yes.
Burris?
Yes.
Frerichs?
Aye.
Gog? I believe Director Gog just made his way into the meeting. Maybe he got out. I will go ahead and come back to that. Lozano?
Aye.
Middleton?
Aye.
Ballard?
Aye.
Thomas is absent. Vice Chair Kozlowski?
Yes.
And Chair Saragosa?
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
All right, thank you, everybody. So we'll go ahead then and move into our items for today. And our first item is our advocacy update. And Christina has this for us this morning.
Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to share my screen if that's possible. I think, there we go. All right, perfect. Here we go. Thank you. So while obtaining Green Means Go funding does remain our priority for the year, as we've discussed, there's also a number of legislative, state legislative issues that we will likely want to engage on this year. So I want to highlight 3 bills in particular today. So that'll be kind of the first half of the presentation. And then we do have our lobbyists here today to talk about Green Means Go and discuss that a little bit more in depth. So moving on first to the bills. The first 2 bills that I want to talk about fall under the SB 375 umbrella. And these are the 2 main bills this year looking to potentially make substantial changes to SB 375 and sustainable community strategies. But before I go into these bills in more depth, I first want to take a step back and talk a little bit bigger picture. Just as a reminder, when we talk about SB 375, we're discussing the Senate bill from 2008 that established the requirement for regions to develop a sustainable community strategy, or SDS, as part of our long-range transportation plan to better coordinate transportation and land use planning while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And through the sustainable community strategy, regions must show a path towards reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and achieve a reduction target that is set by the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. And it also provides some CEQA streamlining for certain projects that are consistent with the region's sustainable community strategy. And as I've mentioned previously, there has been some talk about a revisit to 375 this year. And in preparation for those conversations, at the November Policy and Innovation Committee meeting, we discussed some potential themes that we might want to see in that discussion. There are 3 themes to the types of legislative changes we might want to see to make SB 375 a little bit more effective. The first is implementation support. I think it goes without saying that there's a clear lack of support at the state level for regions to implement their plans. And this could include things like direct funding for regions. So for us, that could mean financial support for Green Means Go, and even thinking about potentially an ongoing funding source for some of our existing programs like Civic Lab and the Rural Main Streets Technical Assistance Program. It's also one of the arguments for Green Means Go as a pilot for the state to regionalize funding to help with these 375 implementation projects. On the policy side, implementation support could help make it easier to accelerate infill development in our region and revitalize commercial corridors. Moving on to the second bucket, the CEQA streamlining. So really looking for opportunities to enhance and expand the current CEQA streamlining opportunities for residential projects that help implement a sustainable community strategy. So essentially finding ways to make it easier for residential projects to get off the ground and into development. This one is probably a pretty tough lift as we've explored it a little bit more in depth. The most impactful option would likely be to create a full CEQA exemption for infill development. There's been some related legislation in the past that's been unsuccessful due to opposition from various stakeholders, but it is something we will obviously want to keep on the table in these discussions. Moving on to the third bucket, pricing. We want to test out different mechanisms to find the best way to implement pricing in our region consistent with our plan, but we need legislation to do that. And so the third theme includes providing regional and local governments the authority to test and pilot roadway pricing mechanisms. So as I mentioned at the beginning, as expected, we have seen some bills introduced this year that appear intended to revisit SB 375. The first is SB 261 by Senator Allen, and this bill can be broken up into 4 main themes. It adds new target dates. Currently, the California Air Resources Board must provide regions with greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for passenger vehicles for 2020 and 2035. This bill would add targets for 2045 and 2050. It also adds vehicle miles traveled or VMT reduction targets in addition to the GHG targets. So it would direct CARB to provide those vehicle miles traveled reduction targets for 2045 and 2050. It also requires city and counties to report to the MPO every other year on the number of housing and jobs and transit supportive infrastructure, existing and planned, that demonstrates implementation of the strategies in the sustainable community strategy. And then finally, it significantly increases the California Air Resources Board's participation in the Sustainable Communities Strategy process. This includes everything from requiring CARB to review our technical methodology for establishing emissions, requiring us to send our draft to the California Air Resources Board before our board adopts the final plan, include our responses to CARB's responses in our final approval, and then sets up a more strict process after we submit our final board-approved sustainable community strategy to CARB. So we're working with our other MPO colleagues and currently and primarily through a statewide association, CalCog, on our initial concerns. And I think that last one on the CARB participation is really where the biggest concern right now lies. And given the extent of the changes in the bill and SB 475, which is the other bill that I'll discuss in a minute, we're putting a lot of focus right now on suggesting that both of these bills become 2-year bills. So essentially what that means is that they wouldn't move forward until next year, so that it would allow time for all of the stakeholders to work together to perhaps try to find some more agreement. So moving on to SB 475, this bill right now just includes intent language. So basically it's just saying that the legislature intends to enact legislation that's going to do a number of things. The bill does outline a number of broad concepts for SB 375 reform, focusing on climate resilience, social equity, and building decarbonization, which appears to be a big issue for the senator. This bill does offer more promise for the possibility of working on some of the goals that I highlighted, given that this new senator previously sat on MTC's board, our equivalent in the Bay Area. And so I think there's a real opportunity there for conversations through MTC to work with the author. So that was a lot on SB 375. It's a big issue, and it looks like it's going to be a big issue this year. So wanted to spend a little bit of time just going into that a little bit more detail. And I want to pause now before I move on to the next bill to see if there's any questions.
Christina, this is Mike Kozlowski. One question about SB 475. I haven't read it. Is there any greater detail on that second bullet point in there at all?
No, so it pretty much, it almost entirely pulls the language, I pulled the language similar to what's in the bill. It's really just, like I said, intent language.
Okay.
So no specifics, it just says that it wants to look at some regional targets for building decarbonization. The author also has another bill this year looking at state buildings and decarbonization. And then through conversations we've had with other stakeholders who've talked to the author's office, just in general, this seems to be a big interest of his, but I don't have an idea yet on what specifically he might be looking to do.
Okay, so for whatever it's worth, if you end up speaking with him about this, I may be able to help you in some way. I work for an energy services company, and all we do is energy efficiency projects for buildings. And I would suggest that it's a righteous goal that he has, but a lot of the buildings that exist in California are sort of past the point of easy stuff to reduce their inherent emissions from, use of electricity or fuel. So the things that are left are expensive things that don't have a quick payback term. The so-called, low-hanging fruit has been picked. So for whatever that's worth.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really helpful. And particularly as we meet with his office and find out more, definitely will probably be reaching out.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, you bet.
All right, Director Lozano.
Yes, thank you. Christina, thank you for this part of the presentation. I do have a question on SB 261, and I think it might be a rhetorical question, but it appears that there are many more requirements being placed on local agencies, cities and counties, and CARB participation. I understand that we have some concerns about that bullet point 4, but is there any word in this Senate bill regarding any funding the state's going to provide local agencies for as a result of this bill?
I'll make a green means go joke. That's the $400 million question. No, it does not include any additional funding. And as I sort of touched on a little bit in what we're looking to provide in these conversations more broadly, is that focus on implementation and really a focus on funding. I think as we've discussed before, there's no funding pot specifically for SB 375 Sustainable Community Strategies requirements and implementation. And that's one of our arguments as we're looking for Green Means Go funding, is that, again, this could be a pilot to show how the state could help with that. But it's definitely a huge issue for us, and I know other regions throughout the state.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Director Stollard.
I think we should be considering opposing legislation that doesn't include funding, because obviously they're trying to tighten up some targets here, which actually adds to the burden we already have, and they're not offering us anything to help us do that. So I think they're putting their line in the sand. I think we need to put ours and say, look, we're open to more aggressive objectives, but they cost money, and it has to be in the bill. Otherwise, how can we countenance supporting it and doing it? One other comment: I'm nervous, as Director Frericks knows. folks who are so strongly concerned about the environment want to constantly reduce target dates. And we don't even have, the science isn't even in place for how you achieve it in some cases. So I feel like it'd be nice if we could at least have a little bit more, let's work on this together. You know, what's magical about 2035? What's magical about 2030 or 45 or 50? I mean, these are just round numbers, half decades or whole decades. I feel like we're throwing darts at a target in the dark. So I feel like I need some more comprehensive education for why some goals are realistic and while others may not be, rather than just picking these round numbers. That's my feeling. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Stollard. Yes, Director Ferrix.
Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate a couple of quick points. So really appreciate, Christina, the update. Lots of chatter on these two bills already in a variety of other circles. I do think it's important to note a couple of things, like just that, first of all, you know, we are in the beginning of a, you know, first year of a 2-year session. This is the mile 1 of the marathon. So, you know, I'm hopeful that, you know, one or both of these authors will be willing to make these bills 2-year bills. But I think, you know, both bills, I think, are going to have a lot of costs associated with them. That's the first and foremost. And I think also just the sort of the outside political dynamics. I mean, you know, if the recall qualifies, which we'll see what happens there, I think you're going to see, you know, the administration sort of not necessarily, you know, taking a lot of major positions on in terms of or being willing to sign some of these bills, you know, if they make it that far this year. So I think that, you know, there's a few sort of those types of dynamics that are out there that are sort of potentially help in our sort of advocacy work. I think also, I would just say I do appreciate that. I think Senator Cortese's bill, you know, seems like it's much more workable, and obviously it's just intent language at the moment. But I mean, he does have that pretty solid track record of in local government and working on these issues. I'm completely baffled by Senator Allen's bill, particularly just in that, you know, it just, yes, he served on a school board previously, but he did not serve in sort of local government, so to speak. And he, you know, it just this bill clearly, and you know, he had this bill last year too, obviously, and it just shows that he has basically doesn't have much of a real clue as to what is really occurring locally. I mean, and I have a lot of respect for him and a lot of the other work that he does, but this one is completely sort of misguided, especially with regard to the fact that, you know, there are a lot of local governments and or regional governments, such as this one, that are trying to do the right thing if they're just actually given the appropriate tools to accomplish some of these goals. So, you know, I know that this is, again, both sort of works in progress, but I do think that it's just keeping in mind, again, that this is the beginning of the marathon and there's a lot of the race left ahead on this. So I don't know if we're sort of going to be just sort of as a status update or taking, you know, potentially trying to take positions or where CalCog is already and such, but I assume that the local governments are going to have, especially among others, are going to have a lot of thoughts and potential concerns about one, but both of these bills potentially. Thanks.
Thank you, Director Ferrix. And I would completely agree with what Lucas just said. We are sort of at the beginning here for a lot of these bills. I do think, knowing Senator Allen, though, he will continue to push forward with probably as many as least amount of amendments as he can take on his legislation from you know, previous bills that Senator Allen's done. But certainly there is plenty of time for folks to weigh in on this. And I would also agree with Director Stollard that you know, as these things crystallize, if they still look the same, that we should really be proactive. And I do think, just in a general terms, it's good for us to be seen out there and for folks to know that, you know, SACOG's taking positions. I think it's just good for our region to be out there on bills so that people are aware that we're paying attention and tracking these things. So with that, I'll hand it back to Christina.
Perfect, thanks. And thanks all for your comments. It's very helpful. The other bill I just want to briefly mention is SB 339 by Senator Wiener. And this bill would extend the California Road Usage Charge pilot program from 2023, when it's currently set to expire, to 2027. It also starts a new pilot program, and it would authorize the collection of a road usage charge revenue from program volunteers. So just a little bit of background. In 2015, the legislature passed and Governor Brown signed SB 1077, which established the Road Usage Charge Technical Advisory Committee, or TAC, to study alternatives to the gas tax. And the bill acknowledged that a transportation funding model tied to fuel consumption is ultimately unsustainable. And so it required the California Transportation Agency, CalSTA, in consultation with the California Transportation Commission, or CTC, to implement a road usage charge program by January 1st of 2017, and to report on those results with recommendations to the legislature. And so that pilot happened, and there was a report given to the legislature at the end of 2017. Now that pilot focused only on mileage reporting and just simulated revenue collection through mock invoices and payments. In 2018, the state extended the life of the advisory committee for an additional 4 years until 2023 to continue to assess alternatives to the gas tax. But neither the authorizing statute or that subsequent legislation to extend the length of the advisory committee specifically authorized road usage charge pilot programs to collect revenue from volunteers. And so what this bill is essentially doing is providing that next step for evaluating the eventual transition from a fuel tax to a road usage charge. And it requires the implementation of a pilot program to study issues specifically related to the collection of revenue for a road usage charge program. And so I highlight that obviously from the transportation funding side of the issue, also because this issue is a key component of our sustainable community strategy, and one of the things that we're looking at when we're having these SB 375 conversations, as well as how we can look at possible pilots in our region. So again, still very early in the process, but wanted to highlight that bill as well today. And so those are just a couple of the, I guess I should say, a few of the many, many bills that we're looking at. So I'll pause again before I kick it over to our lobbyists and Green Means Go.
Okay, any other thoughts or questions here? Okay, Christina, I think we're good to go to our KP folks here.
Perfect, thank you. So let me see how I can, well, I'll start talking and then figure out how to stop sharing my screen once they start talking. So just wanted to give them a little bit of an introduction. I mentioned again, today we wanted to delve into our, thank you, dive into a little bit more about our lobbying for Green Means Go. As we previously mentioned, we did want to try a new path this year by looking at both the state budget request path and track that we've been on in past years, but also sponsoring a policy bill this year that would move through the policy committee process. Since our last meeting, we were able to introduce a policy bill with Assemblymember McCarty. So AB 1209, which establishes the framework for the Green Means Go grant and loan program. And we are still obviously pursuing that state budget request track as well in order to get the actual funding. And we're working very closely in particular with Senator Pan on that effort. So as I mentioned, we invited our lobbyists with KP Public Affairs today to provide some more insight and also share how the committee and the board can really engage on this effort this year. So today we have, excuse me, Brian White and Ed Manning with us. And so with that, I will pass it over to them.
Thank you, Christina and Ed. I know, one thing as you were listening to our last conversation, but just wanted to also get your, 2-minute thoughts as well on, as legislation comes down, the terms of timing when we take positions or don't take positions. And I agree with Lucas that we're early on, so we probably don't want to take an opposed position on a bill at this point, but wanted to get your thoughts from, your expertise in the building as well.
Well, on the, in particular on the Allen bill, you know, if you sort of get the benefit of the doubt the first time you bring forward a bad idea, but not the second time. So I'm a little more aggressive there. And your comments about how he manages his bills, not necessarily being the most open to amendments, is probably my experience as well on recycling, for example. So I think what I would say is, since the CalCog organization is working on this, you know, I'd put them out front, but you know, we would coordinate, you know, James, I'm sure, and Christina are coordinating with the other impacted COGs, and Bill Higgins is the lead for CalCogs. He's very capable as well. But I wouldn't go too long on a bill like this without, you know, explaining the concerns, just given that he's back again with the same bill. And the other thing is, we met with Assemblymember Friedman recently, who chairs the Assembly Transportation Committee this year. She replaced Jim Frazier, who used to chair it. She is also looking at 375 reform. She mentioned to us, and given her position as Transportation Committee chair, I think that would also be a good place for us to work constructively as an alternative. And you know, so I think there are options to, I think you can both oppose the bill and still be interested in promoting constructive change, but we should feel out, you know, the timing on that Allen bill. So
Appreciate that. Thank you, Ed.
yeah, thanks for asking, Michael. So pivoting over to Green Means Go, it feels like it should be, you know, June or July, but it's only the beginning of March. It's been busy on this issue. We began, you know, we sort of never stopped after last year. And so we worked through the fall on this. And then in January, we briefed all of our delegation again, January into February, and organized them again on this issue. So a couple things on, and Christina mentioned we have a dual path approach this year, which is to both do a bill to organize around and try to educate folks to establish the Green Means Go pilot program in statute, and use that as a way to get to funding, but also separate and apart from the legislative process. Many of you know, we have a budget process, which has a separate timetable and a separate process. So we're doing both tracks. On the budget track, we got the delegation to sign a letter to the Director of Finance, Keely Bosler, who we've met with several times and is somewhat sympathetic, I think, fair to say, towards Green Means Go and what we're trying to do. But this was a great way to start to give her cover, hopefully within the administration, to be more supportive. She actually responded very quickly to the letter from the delegation. Dr. Pan's office reached out, and both Senators Nielsen, Pan, and Assembly Member Aguirre-Curry, I think, and perhaps McCarty will be having a meeting with her to talk about funding Green Means Go, which is great. So that's one path we're actively pursuing. Dr. Pan is probably going to be a budget conferee this year, which is critically important. And budget conferee is Sacramento speak for, there's a joint Assembly Senate budget committee that meets and makes a lot of decisions about what goes in and out of the budget. And at this point, if Dr. Pan is on, that would mean we'd have Dr. Pan, Kevin McCarty, and Jim Nielsen, Senator Nielsen, as potentially three conferees from our region, all of whom are supporting Green Means Go. And Dr. Pan has made this one of his primary budget requests as well. So that all is very, very helpful. On the legislative side, we've introduced AB 1209, which has language that we drafted and worked with Assemblymember McCarty on and Legislative Council. It was a long process to get Assemblymember McCarty to introduce the bill, but he did, and that's put us in a very good place. As I said, he's a budget conferee. We've already gotten feedback from ARB, who asked for some clarifying amendments in the intent language, but who say they will be favorable to the bill. We're doing outreach. We have a meeting coming up with, actually, James set up a meeting with Supervisor Cerna, who's an ARB member, and then we have a meeting coming up that I set up with the new chair of the Air Board, Leanne Randolph, to talk to her about Green Means Go. So we're trying to make sure the Air Board says the right things and is supportive, given that they conditioned our sustainable community strategy with the funding of Green Means Go to get to the 19% target. We've got to have two processes coming up at once that we will need everyone's help with. One is obviously committee hearings. The bill's not set yet, but we've been dual referred to Housing Committee and what was the other one, Brian?
Transportation.
Oh, transportation, correct. Which with Assemblymember Friedman, who we've already briefed on Green Means Go, and we think will be supportive. Assemblymember Chu chairs the Housing Committee, and we've worked with he and his consultants a lot. So we will need help targeting the members on those committees. We have then we will also be organizing around the budget subcommittee process, where key budget subcommittees start meeting soon, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to raise Green Means Go there. So that all will be places we will need engagement and help. In addition, we are continuing to work with third-party stakeholders in the region, from business groups, civic groups, labor, et cetera, to focus them on Green Means Go. We had a meeting last week to get them up to speed. We're already asking them for letters of support to Assemblymember McCarty, and then we'll ask them again to send letters to the key budget subcommittees and key committees that'll be hearing AB 1209. So there is a lot going on, and we will need your help with members you have relationships with, key stakeholders, both local and statewide. So for example, if we get the local building trades in support of the bill, we'll try to elevate that to the state building trades. Same with the realtors, same with the builders, same with some environmental organizations. So the process is just starting to really kick in, and we're looking forward to, having an opportunity this year that we didn't get last year because of COVID.
Great, thank you, Ed. Directors, any questions for Ed and the team? All right, I do have one question. In terms of budget subcommittee, do we have a sense of where it'll end up, since it's going to housing and transportation as for double referral, where it may end up in the budget process? Sorry, my being green here means my lights go out every few minutes.
Yeah, we have started engaging budget committee on both sides and leadership staff. Vanessa, we've targeted, what, 2 probably
Yeah, so we have briefed the staff who cover both the housing, transportation, and environmental issues that all of our components cover. So our hope is that, particularly with the support of all of the legislators whom we have placed within these budget committees, that we can find a sweet spot on how they'll be placed, but everybody's getting briefed on it.
Thank you. And I will say for my fellow directors, the two new transportation chairs this year in both the Assembly and the Senate, I do think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, but I do think there may be more, what's the word? They may be more amenable to our ideas this year than maybe previous transportation chairs, even though these chairs may not agree with some of my other people that I work for that may not be as happy, but I think on this particular issue, we may find hopefully some support there.
I think that's right. I'm cautiously optimistic we'll get a good reception. And I think in terms of where Assemblyman Friedman is going and what she's thinking about, I think, our plan and where we're going as an agency lines up pretty well with where she sees the future. So
great, thank you.
Chair Saragosa, do you mind if I just again, maybe for our new directors, just try to, I certainly appreciate the engagement on Christina's presentation of bills, and then you just heard a little bit about this significant effort, right, around Green Means Go. And I just want to highlight the way we're trying to approach Green Means Go as a template for how we think we need to sort of organize ourselves, right, as the greater Sacramento region, which is essentially to say to the state of California, okay, we understand you've got really important environmental goals and climate goals, housing goals. How do we take those goals, the state, do our part, but do it in a way that works for us, right? Do it in a way that works for our local governments, our redevelopment needs, and frankly, using a lot of our great kind of data and analysis. And Green Means Go is literally achieving state goals on our local terms. It's a bottom-up approach to this. And it is the way, it's the template that I think we need to approach a lot of these like major policy challenges at the state level. They're going to kind of keep coming at us. And those green zones that 23 of your jurisdictions have identified are the local templates for how this works. So again, I think we're trying to constructively engage the state, and we're trying to take things like SB 375 and say, we hear you. Here's how we think it could work in our region. And here's the kind of partnership we want with the state, not you giving us things we can't achieve, but actually a partnership, and that has a local element, a regional element for SACOG, and a state investment piece of that. And that, in my mind, is a really important way to understand us approaching all this policy work.
Thank you, James. Well said. Director Koslowski.
Yeah, hey, maybe just to kind of refresh my memory and for the benefit of everybody, either James or Ed, I happen to be speaking to the Sacramento Builders Exchange in the next few weeks, and then a joint meeting of BIA and some realtors later in the month as well. How would you kind of elevator pitch Green Means Go for those types of audiences in order to kind of start to build their support, concurrence, whatever you want to call it?
James, you want to take it? Or do you want me?
Director Koslowski, it's almost like that was a setup, because do we have a PowerPoint deck for you? I just went to the North State BIA last week and talked sort of generally about our housing efforts and Mind the Gap and housing elements, but very specifically too about Green Means Go. So obviously we'll follow up and give you some of those, the deck, but also help you walk through some of those points. Ed, do you have? Ed or Christine?
No, I was going to say, it should be an easy sell. I mean, we've got examples of areas that are in green zones that you've identified where if there's money to get the infrastructure put in, it changes the whole dynamic for builders looking to invest. And then, you get the infrastructure jobs on the front end, and then, a lot of great housing product and mixed use and development on the back end. So, and the slides that James has really do a great job telling that story.
And I'll just jump in and add that the BIA and the realtors in particular have been very supportive already. So obviously this year, we're looking for support letters again, but so far they've been supportive and helping, particularly on the realtor side, having their members reach out to legislators as well, in addition to supporting themselves.
Gotcha. Okay, good. Well, like I said, I'm going to be speaking with the Sacramento Builders Exchange sometime soon, and that's another avenue to trades, right? So just thought I'd mention it. Thank you both.
Thank you, Mike. And Christina, Ed, if there's sample support letters that we could get out to the directors, certainly I think that would be great as well, if they have any third parties that they could share them with, or from themselves, from their jurisdictions, for both. And I know same for me, definitely send them for me, and I'll make sure to talk to the basic crafts as well, to get individual letters, like from operating engineers, carpenters, and laborers, and those guys as well. So
that would be great.
I can take that part of the checklist.
Thanks. Yeah, we have sample letters for both the budget ask and AB 1209 that we'll send to you along with our fact sheet. So that'd be very helpful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Ed. We'll go ahead. Is there any public comments on this item?
There's no public comment.
Okay. Well, Ed, Vanessa, Brian, thank you very much. Christina, thank you very much for the presentation, and we will continue to push hard on this one. I do think it's incredibly important for us to keep moving that, to keep moving Green Means Go and being aggressive on this, so that we can get something for our region this year. Thank you. Okay. With that, we will move on to item 3, which is the Exploring Innovation at SACOG, and Monica has this presentation for us this morning. Good morning, Monica.
Good morning. How are you? Renee, you'll advise me if I do anything wrong with my video. You'd think after almost a year I'd have it down, but we'll get started. So I'm really excited to be here. You've had the morning start off with the P, lots of policy, and now let's jump into the I of the Policy and Innovation Committee. So innovation can be a lot of things. I think exclusively right now it is a buzzword, and that's not lost on me. It's often seemingly connected to technology, but at SACOG, it's really about new approaches to big problems. It begins and it ends with the people we are trying to serve, and it requires us to rethink how we listen, who we listen to, how we measure, and to embrace risk and failure as opportunities. At its core, innovation puts great ideas into action. It calls for making things happen in a resourceful and meaningful way. The shorthand that our team here at SACOG uses is really that innovation is where creativity and implementation connect and meet. Foundational to innovation at SACOG is design thinking, or human-centered design. It's the same terminology for the same essential process. We embrace at SACOG innovation in the public interest. There's a lot of opportunity, but there's also a lot of peril with technology. And innovation isn't technology dependent, but it does help to enable different types of innovations. So for my presentation today, I am going to just quickly walk through the design thinking process. And at the end of that, I am going to give you a few examples of what we've done over the last few years. So high level, let's jump into design thinking, or human-centered design. The first phase is empathizing. This is really about understanding and hearing the feelings or impacts of the stakeholders in order to better serve them. Another way to think about it is observing or gathering information on the human experience, and this can take many forms. You could do interviews, you can have immersion, participatory research, which is journal, user-created content. You kind of identify pain points in a process or a program And this can also be qualitative and quantitative. And it's important to highlight the qualitative nature of this. As a transportation planning agency, so much of our work relies on quantitative data. And if you've been part of our race, equity, and inclusion work, you've heard that there is lack of quantitative data to really serve smaller communities or smaller segments. And it's really hard to bring, to disaggregate much of our data to really understand certain communities. And so quantitative data is a big piece of design thinking. Next, we have our define phase. This is about getting to the core problem, meaning that when you start thinking and entering into a space, you have to throw out your assumptions. This is really hard for planners. But in order to really get to more successful and improved outcomes, you really have to throw out the ideas and the assumptions that we come in with. And during the define stage, we start to break apart a problem into components, which is really helpful in a deeper understanding of the problem you are trying to solve before rushing to solve a problem. And this is really impactful when you're working with hard to reach groups or with just a group in general. This also starts to tease apart or helps to highlight unintended consequences. When you start defining these problems, you can start to bring in, okay, well, what are the unintended consequences? Which as planning staff is sometimes challenging because we're really focused on a solution, and this helps to mitigate against those unintended consequences. It doesn't preclude it from happening, but it does help to set up a frame to really mitigate those issues. Some ways that you can define a core challenge. So if you were going into a design thinking process, you might do experience diagramming or journey mapping, really kind of mapping out what the person that you're trying to solve. So for example, and I've used this example before, but I really like it. I think it really highlights design thinking. In Southern California, I believe it was in San Diego, there was an intersection or a block where there were a tremendous amount of pedestrian versus vehicle serious injuries and fatalities. So planners went in, they did some workshops, they did, all the quantitative design, engineering, ped counts, and elected to put a crosswalk at the intersection. So great job, we got the intersection, it's gonna be safer. Well, there was no marked change or improvement on those pedestrian versus vehicle injuries. So trying to understand the problem a little bit deeper, the planning staff went in and did observations and interviews with folks. Well, that street design had a bus stop on one side of the street in the middle of the block. So if I'm recalling correctly, this is sunny San Diego, nice and warm. And there was one tree on both sides of that street, and it was on the opposite side of the bus stop. So what people were doing was waiting on one side of the street in the middle of the block under the tree to get some shade. And as they saw their bus approaching, they were not running to the lighted intersection. They were darting out across the street so that they wouldn't miss their bus. And therefore, the problem was better understood. And so there were new ways to think about that. So that's kind of an experience or diagramming early on would have actually discovered that. Other activities include the 5 whys exercise. That's something we use at SACOG a lot. And then also things like fact, opinion, or guess. What are the facts of the problem? What are our opinions? And what are our guesses or hypotheses? These exercises are really designed to challenge our assumptions about the problem. The next phase is ideation. I think this is a lot of fun. This is the spaghetti on the wall moment where you really just focus on generating potential solutions. This isn't where you start to measure or assess them. That comes next. So you might bring ideas forward with brainstorming, another activity which I think is pretty fun and not how we usually think is, what is the worst possible idea? It's one of my favorites because it creates it creates a lot of laughter and it relaxes folks and really gets you kind of excited about, all right, what are the worst possible things? And then you can kind of switch to, all right, what are the things we think might actually work? Ideation can be done in small groups. It could be done individually and you could come back together. It could be done as an entire group. Other ways to do ideation that you may have heard of are storyboarding or co-creation workshops. That's where you bring your users in with the planning staff or the professional staff. This step of ideation should really push participants beyond what is feasible, beyond what is already tested or what feels kind of safe. A lot of times in the public sector, we want to replicate what was already successful in another place because it really feels a little bit safe. Well, if it worked over here, let's just do the same thing over here. And there's just one constant that these solutions that we are ideating about or brainstorming really have to fit that user experience. And then the next phase of design thinking is prototyping. This is where you can go really big or really small to essentially create scaled down versions of your product or your solution. And it helps to reveal early problems or challenges with your design. Prototyping offers the opportunity to bring ideas to life, test the feasibility of whatever you're bringing forward, whether it's a complete street. In technology space, a lot of times there'll be apps. This is really where the rubber hits the road. So you're literally looking to throw darts at a project before you settle on a single idea or a handful of ideas to actually test out. So different ways that you can prototype. You could do very crude and analog paper and crafts. One of the things that I had worked on with a design thinking, we created fake app. We were testing out an app and we actually drew the different pieces onto paper. So you were not actually playing with a phone, but you were pretending and working through, and you actually found those challenges. I think we've all been on those websites or apps where you just can't figure out, why are they asking me yes or no again? I just said yes before. Why do I have to say yes again? So this really is about looking at what are the challenges and opportunities. How can we better serve the audience? And we're getting some immediate feedback. So the prototype phase could also be really expensive depending on what kind of project you're working on, if you work for the private sector. And it's really about selecting, actually looking about soliciting feedback. So prototyping and testing are actually a little bit of a back and forth, and you'll see this as kind of an infinity symbol. That's intentional because you are often going back and forth on these different phases. So the one thing about testing that isn't really represented in this diagram is that testing can be taken throughout the design thinking process. It's most commonly done after or in part with the prototyping phase. So as you're building a prototype, whether it's a crude prototype, analog done in a 15-minute to an hour session, or it's a really expanded prototype, you want to be doing that testing back and forth. And it's ideally done with the users, but that's not always feasible. So some examples of kind of the big prototype test was one that was done with Audi. So I got to hear a presentation by the design thinking team at Audi, and they were looking at doing essentially kind of an Uber type program, but with Audis. So you can imagine this is a clientele with disposable income, and this was pre-pandemic. So to create their prototype, they actually did a mock-up app, and they worked with their executive teams, and they recruited some folks just the way you would recruit for a public sector focus group. And they did this prototype, and they worked out with the app and immediately found from like the app logging on, there were issues with logging on, there were issues with what kind of information you had to provide. So they were able to very immediately figure out, okay, this idea is, we thought it was going to be great. Here's what our users want. And Audi drivers, because they were really focused on Audi drivers and how to expand that Audi experience. At the end of their experimenting and trial, they ended up just killing the project because they didn't want to throw more money away. Now, you might think, well, that's not really great if they had this great idea and then they just killed it. Well, the alternative would have been launching this program, spending much more money, and then realizing it was a total failure. So design thinking is used at micro scale. It can be used at a macro scale. It really is part of the startup community and process. So that's where we've learned a lot of this, and we've brought that in. And it's actually, I think, helped us in our big innovation space connect with the private sector and technology mobility providers. So in closing, I just want to touch on some of the workplace and stakeholder benefits that come from this type of thinking. One thing that we have seen since we've really started applying design thinking since about 2017 is where we, I think, really started to frame it and use it, where we have maybe used some of these strategies and programs and projects, just not named them explicitly or as part of a design thinking process. SACOG is supporting our members and the region to establish itself as a test bed, where we work as a matchmaker with mobility and technology companies. We're helping to give the region a seat at the table with the technology mobility space, which I think is really important. We want to be a place where we can work with private sector mobility providers, new technologies, and actually have a seat at the table. So as products or ideas are taking shape, there's representation from community, from government stakeholders, so that we don't end up in the place where, you know, new things are just kind of plopped onto community and sometimes can create a lot of havoc. Having a seat at the table helps us to inform, and the feedback we've gotten from different mobility providers is really positive. In one, we are able to help set performance metrics, and we are able to better understand their needs, but we're able to help represent the needs of our community. So we're not just coming in to experiment for experiment's sake, but we are really looking to match ideas with identified problems or need. So with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to answer questions. You're going to hear a lot more about how we're using design thinking on ourselves and in the Mobility Accelerator. Later this year, you will get a presentation from Connor Peterson, who's going to talk about some of our shared services, which really focuses on how we are using this approach to save money for our local jurisdictions, which is great, with some procurement opportunities. And I'm going to stop right there because I'll keep talking.
All right. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you.
Do we have any comments or questions at this point? I will say that the design team at Pontiac, when they built the Aztec, did not go through this process when they delivered that monstrosity to the market. All right. Well, Renee, do we have any? Yes.
Just want to make a comment.
Yes.
Want to thank Monica for this great presentation. It's really outstanding. It's something that we do every day, but we don't think about it in our daily life. And the way she described the 5 steps is really awesome. And I think that a lot of time, you know, something that makes us move is a necessity, is a mother of invention. So a lot of time we don't think about it till our back is up against the wall, and then we trying to figure out a way to scramble out of the mess that we're in. But really good, great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Director Gog. And agreed. I mean, I think the whole idea of just putting aside our own assumptions on things that we think are sort of foundational even is very difficult to do, and to step outside of that box, if you will. So again, thank you for that. Renee, do we have any public comments on this item?
We do not have any public comment.
Okay, so with that, Monica, again, thank you for the presentation. We look forward to the next item, and we will then move on to item 5.
Thank you.
Or excuse me, item 4, which is the Civic Lab Innovative Mobility Accelerator update. And Adrian has this for us this morning. Thank you, Adrian.
Good morning, everyone. Adrienne Retz, your SACOG staff. In the middle of 2020, we as SACOG postponed our planned Civic Lab Mobility Accelerator. So we're revisiting that work now. And the Policy and Innovation Committee is the home to both Civic Lab and the Innovative Mobility Program. So I'm going to talk about how we're applying that design thinking process on ourselves with a specific program. So just quickly today, I'm going to provide a little bit of history and context for both Civic Lab and our Innovative Mobility Program, just to set the groundwork, and then talk about where we've been with the Mobility Accelerator, where we are now, and how we're rethinking it for a spring launch, and then what's next, and prompt this committee with some questions, because we'd appreciate your feedback as we're considering what this program looks like going forward. So again, I just want to provide a little bit of background and context on the Innovative Mobility Program as a whole, because it is the house or home to the Civic Lab Mobility Accelerator, which is the focus of today's topic. So the Innovative Mobility Program as a whole really does connect our existing infrastructure, so our existing roadways, with new services and technology. So in our programming, a typical year looks like grant opportunities for our member jurisdictions, and it's a lot of participatory programming like May is Bike Month, and all of this work is for the 6-county SACOG region. And the goal with this work in innovative mobility is really to reduce vehicle miles traveled for a few reasons. That really gets us closer to our greenhouse gas reduction target that's set forth for us in our long-range transportation plan, the MTP. We talked a lot this morning about Green Means Go, and one of the focus areas of Green Means Go is, accelerating travel options. And so this work in innovative mobility really fits into that. How can we change people's behavior, get them out of their cars? Over the past few years, we have really focused on making this program, Innovative Mobility, much more nimble, more performance-driven, and agile. We've focused a lot on pilot projects. So to us in this program, a pilot project is a small scale on the ground project that's lower cost. It tests concepts and really provides performance information faster. So typically for this program specifically, that's a project around $100,000 or less, typically between 6 to 12 months, and it's an on the ground demonstration project. An example would be a micro transit service that is happening in West Sacramento. That's an example of a pilot project. And we do this, we've really shifted to kind of focus on pilot projects in this work because we get learnings faster and we're able to share those broadly. So if we understand more about that micro transit service that happened in West Sacramento, then we can share that with other member jurisdictions and partners. So as they're planning for future work, they can get those learnings and be able to plan for better projects. So again, going back to the kind of bigger picture here, in the innovative mobility framework that we currently have adopted, it's a $3 million program for the total budget. And we've essentially split that work into half. Civic Lab Mobility Accelerator, again, the focus of today's conversation, is one half, and the other half is transportation demand management. Transportation demand management is really exactly what it says. It's managing the demand of our roadways. Again, kind of the opposite of infrastructure. It is the home to a lot of our core programming to reduce vehicle miles traveled, like May is Bike Month. We work a lot with employers from around the region to provide incentives to help them cut their driving. We are doing work in telework right now because of the pandemic. So these two big efforts kind of make up our innovative mobility program as a whole. And with that background in the innovative mobility program, can get to the mobility accelerator. So we had designed this mobility accelerator originally to launch again last year in 2020. It's really a program for our SACOG members to develop and launch pilot projects to solve big scale transportation challenges at the local level. Again, we had $1.5 million, and we still have that dollar amount to implement the pilot projects that came out of this work. And this was planned to be our third round of the Civic Lab program. So we started Civic Lab in 2018. It's really our version of a startup accelerator. We put cross-sector project teams together with really new and unique and different partners to hone on really specific challenges focused on transportation or land use. We get to the root cause of that challenge, then we explore all the opportunities of what might be, and then develop a solution and put a project onto the ground. So if I could kind of sum up why we do this Civic Lab pilot testing type of work in a photo, it would be this one. Too often we think we know the solution to a challenge, exactly what Monica was just mentioning, and we spend big investments in time and capital to sometimes miss the mark. Let me provide a disclaimer here. This is not from our region. This is a stock image I took from elsewhere. We do a great job here, but we can't really design for our own interests or ourselves. We have to design for the person walking on the dirt path there with the shopping bag, right? And when I'm talking about the Civic Lab Mobility Accelerator, the user is actually you, the local jurisdiction. So the person with a shopping bag is our member jurisdictions, our partners, our transit agencies who participate in the program. But the Mobility Accelerator is designed to address this exact issue and challenge. So it really takes the principles of design thinking that Monica was talking about and applies them to transportation and the challenges we face in transportation. And to talk about Civic Lab in some images, it's intensive. we solicit for cross-sector project teams from around the region typically, and then we take them through a 6 to 12 month long accelerator. And what that means is we have expert-led monthly workshops. We bring experts in from all over the country on different topic areas. We assign homework to our project teams. They get assignments. An example of that is in 2019, we had all of our project teams ride the bus around their communities to experience what that was like for a user. We've had the project teams walk corridors to understand what it's like to be a person going to retail shops and businesses. Again, it's a quite intensive program, but it's really exciting because, again, it's just such a cross-sector project teams that we bring together. So in 2019, we had city managers and brewery owners on project teams. You'll see in the bottom right image, that's Director Wendy Thomas, who's absent today, but she participated in one of our project teams for Placerville. We also had the city of Ileton, which has only 800 total people in the city, had our biggest project team to date. And we've had some really good outcomes of this work so far. So some of the projects, we launched a passenger autonomous shuttle at Sac State. In El Dorado County, we closed down one lane of traffic on Carson Road in Apple Hill. That allowed for a passenger bus shuttle to go through and allow for emergency vehicle travel, reduce congestion by 45 minutes. And in Yolo County, Yolo Bus launched an on-demand shuttle for an underserved community in Knights Landing. So we have a few years of history with Civic Lab generally and our transportation work. So if a jurisdiction and project team commits, to taking risks and exploring these opportunities, applying design thinking in this way, we as CIVCOG work to identify funding and put these projects onto the ground. So we knew for this round, the Mobility Accelerator, we wanted to streamline this. We were planning to accomplish this in 12 weeks instead of 12 months. We had heard from jurisdictions, this is an intensive program and committing to a 12-month long effort is quite strenuous. So we had already tried to streamline it and make it the greatest hits of Civic Lab, if you will. And that kind of leads us to the timeline that I laid out in your item. So in September of 2019, we had this framework adopted. And then by February of 2020, we had already solicited for and received 17 applications for this Mobility Accelerator. So we started having conversations with your staff, local jurisdictions, transit agencies, partners, March, April, very beginning of the pandemic. And the conversations very quickly shifted to how local priorities were shifting, There were a lot of concerns from local staff, especially on how to participate in an intensive accelerator, and all the potential challenges and opportunities with virtual participation. At this time, March, April, even into May, some of our applicants did not even have video cameras. We as SACOG have always done this in person. So there was a lot of consideration of what this looks like virtually. So by May, after all these conversations, communicating with youth policymakers, we postponed the Mobility Accelerator. We've been doing other programming work since then, but now, you know, it's time for us to rethink what this is, and that's why we're here today. Essentially, you know, we're taking this infinity loop that Monica discussed and applying it to ourselves. How can we understand from you, our partners, our private sector vendors, the applicants, what you need here and now, and then create a new program based off of that. This is us coming to this with completely fresh eyes. And this is essentially what we're doing. First, we need to understand what are the transportation issues right now. Transportation generally changes all the time. There's new technology. We're learning and adapting all of the time, but especially in the pandemic, we really want to understand and figure out what are your top priorities in terms of transportation and how might we help solve them. Then we'll, you know, design a program framework, bring that back to you as this committee, and launch something that's context sensitive. And what that means is, you know, we've been in a pandemic over the past year, so we have to be sensitive to that as we're designing this new version of the Mobility Accelerator. So we're really stage one right now. We have been talking with regional managers, our transit coordinating committee. We're talking with the former applicants of this program, partners. We've been issuing a short survey, having conversations. We are really trying to understand what big transportation challenges are. So I do want to share quickly what we've heard so far. This may or may not be a surprise. You know a lot about transit. Director Saragosa, I heard you mention the front of the meeting. You've taken the bus a few times, and there's not been many other people on the bus with you. So ridership, of course, is a big concern, especially for transit agencies, but broadly, we've heard that. We've also heard a lot about short and long-term project planning. And if you think about it, it makes sense. It's difficult to think even 6 months down the road about putting transportation projects on the ground, especially new or innovative mobility projects, when we're still getting information about vaccine distribution, how we're reopening. There's just so many considerations at this time. And we're also hearing a ton about how we innovate on our existing transportation services. So a few examples of that: Paratransit Inc. has, you know, used their transit vehicles for food distribution. SAC-RT, the transit agency, worked with the City of Sacramento and State Transportation Agency to deploy buses as hotspots. There's lots of innovation that's happening around the transportation space. And I think our transit agencies, our jurisdictions and partners are really trying to figure out how we continue to do that as we're coming out of the pandemic. We've also been, you know, trying to figure out how can we as SACOG help address these. And this is what we're hearing in that space. Of course, opportunities for funding, either grants, participatory programs like Civic Lab, and a lot of things that are very much in common with our Civic Lab format. So meeting with colleagues from around the region to discuss solutions. We've been doing that over the past few years. I've seen great success. Nothing better than talking with your peers about what challenges you're facing and how you might solve them. Expert-led trainings, educational guides, one-on-one small group work. I think the good thing we're seeing from this is that we've transitioned some of this work so far to a virtual environment. Civic Lab can focus on mobility, but it's also focused on more land use. And we recently hosted a virtual housing series. That was a four-part virtual series where we brought in experts, we had conversations and really engaging sessions with our local planners, and we saw great success. So I think we can apply these things in a virtual environment. So we're taking the challenges and combining them with the things we're hearing about how we can address them and bringing forward a new program. So with that leads us to next steps and what we're here today. You know, we're designing this program. We hope to continue to have these conversations with partners throughout March. and then have high level concepts and a program design solidified by April, and then have a spring launch. We don't have an exact date for that because we're trying to work best with our jurisdictions and partners. So with that, I'd love to hear from you. Are there partners or constituents you think I should be talking to? We really do want to understand who we should be reaching out to. We're trying to go far and wide with this. So we're talking with your jurisdictions, we're talking with transit agencies, but if there are other partners, please let us know. And if I'm going to go back here just to the list of challenges, if you think something is missing from this list, or if there's a priority for you as a policymaker, we'd also really like to hear that. So with that, I'll stop for questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Any questions at this moment? Comments? Get around, make sure. All right. I do have a question in terms of, I mean, I've seen it, and you mentioned it, in terms of transit revenue and loss. I mean, I know, and I'm sure we weren't the only jurisdiction that went through this, where for months, you know, we weren't even collecting a toll for anybody using our transit, and then we slowly came back to that, but still it's been a fraction of where we were. So we're facing not only you know, decreased ridership, but hugely decreased revenue, layoffs, and then also on top of that, with having to convert our fleet from gas or natural gas to electric, and the challenges facing that sort of long term. And I don't know, I mean, sort of maybe it's more of a comment, but just, I mean, there's just a ton of, you know, challenges there, I think, for jurisdictions across SACOG, you know, that we're going to have to face, even though we know that transit is going to be a big part of the future in terms of mass transit, but the interim steps, though, are very painful.
Yeah, that's a great point, Director Saragosa. I think one of our favorite things to say in Civic Lab is we don't know what we don't know. So this is truly the place to test out potential solutions. You know, obviously these are big concerns around transit. And so what might we be able to test for a short amount of time to see if it sticks? If yes, then great. How can we expand, get other types of funding? If not, that's okay too. What learnings can we take out of that? We are working really closely internally with our next generation transit planning effort. That group has just concluded an existing conditions report of transit around the region. And something that we're hearing through that is that on-demand or microtransit services are responding more quickly. So things like that, we of course want to take into consideration, working with our transit coordinating committee and the transit agencies and with jurisdictions to kind of figure out what solutions might be. So it's absolutely something, I don't know if we have an answer yet, right? But that's something we're going to continue to explore because it's a huge challenge and priority that we've heard so far.
Thank you. Director Stollard, and then Kozlowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm really interested, Adrian, in seeing competent data about the VIA system in West Sacramento. I mean, how much is it costing? I mean, is it really efficient? And I understand, you know, YOLO Bus is still operating its local lines running throughout that city. Is that necessary? Is that duplicative? You know, we want to make sure that our limited transportation dollars go right where we need them. We want to have a VIA system here in Woodland. Our geography is very favorable to it. We're 4 miles on the side. I can ride my bike corner to corner in Woodland in less than 15 minutes. So it seems to me like a perfect community for this kind of opportunity. But I can't get any data yet to tell me how to do it, or, you know, or working with our transit district, which has obviously interest in protecting and maintaining the local bus system. Anyway, all of these questions continue to revolve and not seem to come to any resolution. Is there something that we could look to Civic Lab to kind of sort through for us? But I think we'd want to start with West Sacramento situation and have independent analysis.
Director Sollard, we just had a conversation with the city of Auburn, who's having very similar considerations. What would a more on-demand type of transportation system look like? They already have a fleet that can be more dynamic. So what we're doing in that situation is pointing them to the Transit Coordinating Committee and really having those, exactly what we are hearing, those conversations with peers. So we can certainly follow up with you specifically with data from the VIA system in West Sacramento, but I still think there's, things for us to consider and just communicate on the various on-demand systems, because we're seeing them, SAC-RT has a quite robust on-demand system in Smart Ride. We have the VIA system, we have the one in Yolobus. So now at this point, we're really gaining those learnings where we can help share the good, bad, and ugly with other communities to figure out if it would work for you.
Yeah, I'd like to add, I don't believe that one size fits all. I think obviously buses work in large urban settings like Sacramento, where you have to move lots of people. And it certainly works in Davis, where we have thousands and thousands of students, and it's a very well-used system. But in our smaller communities, and Woodland 60,000 isn't small, but we're much smaller than certainly than Sacramento, with a compact geography, and many of our jurisdictions are similarly laid out and populated. We ought to be pioneering this everywhere we can, in my opinion, because heck, nobody wants to wait. We know that the biggest issue with transit is frequency, right? At least one of the biggest issues. And if you go point to point, that issue goes away. You just wait until the ride comes, and it takes you right to where you want to go. So you don't mind waiting in your house for it or in front of your house. But if you have to walk and then wait for half an hour, you know what I'm saying. So, okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Do you mind if I make a comment on that? And sorry, Director Kozlowski, if that's okay, but just on Director Stollard's point, and I hope you take this in the spirit of Civic Lab, right? I was thinking as Monica was making her presentation, just some background noise there. As Monica was making her presentation, I was just thinking back to myself, why is this so important? Is this a cool, shiny thing, or is this a must-have? And I think this is a must-have for the region. I don't think we have any choice other than to pursue creative ways of problem solving, because we do not have the pocketbook to solve all our problems old style. But and as a transportation planner, right, one of the sins of the transportation profession is that we have a knee-jerk response. We think we know how to solve all of your problems, right? You need a highway lane or you need a bus, right? Those are sort of we know exactly what you need. And I think the Civic Lab approach is and this is what Monica was walking you through, right? Let's truly understand what the problem is we're trying to solve, and let's come up with some creative ways of trying to solve that. I might bring Monica in after the discussion just to come back and say a little bit more about one of the biggest things I think we have stumbled across is procurement. Procurement actually holds back a lot of our ability to creatively solve things. But I would say too, be very mindful that we don't copy and paste microtransit. It's a really cool, I want to know too, Director Stoller, how's VIA working? Is this the answer, right? Point to point, on demand, it sounds great. At the same time, I think there's also things we can do in the transit space of restructuring routes, of, because in some ways a frequent bus on a schedule that actually carries a lot of people is the cheapest way to move folks. So just a reminder for all of us not to be careful of copy and pasting other successes. And again, that's a little bit of, I think, what we're trying to accomplish here in Civic Lab. So I hope that makes sense.
If I could also respond to that, I get it, and I agree with that. One size doesn't fit all. I said that.
Yeah.
Although that's why I want to know what works and what doesn't work in the VIA system, so we can try something with them. But face it, folks are not riding these buses. At Yolo Transit, we're down to about a third of what we were before pandemic, and who knows? We're not encouraging everybody to return to exactly to their behavior beforehand. We want to keep them using Zoom calls so they're not congesting the roadways and things like that. So it's an opportunity time, and I think we should be open to it. But people do have their vested interests, and it's very hard, especially in government, it's very hard to break through them sometimes to get people willing to countenance new ways of doing things. So I think you're right about Civic Lab. It's important. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You're muted, Michael.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Tom. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I have a brief question. Then Adrian, I'd like to follow. I'd like to have a longer discussion about a discrete idea that I have. Is the autonomous shuttle test project still going at Sac State?
No, that was a 3-month-long effort in, oh my goodness, very early or late 2019. So
Yeah.
no, it's not going any longer. However, we do have learnings from that, and all of our Civic Lab projects that have been on the ground so far, we have high-level summary and learnings from that we're happy to share.
Could we call on that company to provide an autonomous shuttle for some reasonable expense if we had a route that we wanted to test out in our own community?
Yes, and let me say that. So I think one of the things we've really worked hard to do in the Civic Lab program is cultivate good relationships with our private sector partners. And through the first year of Civic Lab that was focused on mobility, we saw a lot of benefit in that. We got significantly reduced costs in things like the autonomous shuttle. Like 1/3 of the cost or more was cut off the price for this type of pilot project. So we would have to continue that conversation. I think, again, just echoing what James is talking about, I think, we have this kind of set of partners and relationships that we've built, and that's our job, is to match them up with you. So if you need a solution that connects to transit, then we can help you find that. Maybe the answer is autonomy, maybe it's something else. So we're happy to explore that with you, but we can open that conversation. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to talk to you after we're done here today, just about that.
Sure, I'll follow up.
I'm a vote for autonomous in the Palladio region for Mike down there. I think that would be awesome. I know you didn't say that, but
I think the Palladio, unless it's just looping inside the Palladio, there's like real complicated traffic issues on the major roads. But there is an opportunity to do a weekday version of it, I think, in certain subdivisions where it doesn't have to leave to go to the major road as a grocery getter kind of solution, and also on our Sutter Street downtown. So, Michael, back and forth on Street in Placerville is kind of what I'm thinking for Sutter Street, that it would be ideal for that kind of use, because more or less the traffic moves at a pretty slow pace, and it's
this is from you.
a discrete route.
This is from First American.
makes sense.
Yeah.
That'll be fun. It'll be interesting to hear more on that one. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Sorry. Any other questions or comments? All right. Seeing none. Do we have any public comments?
There's no public comment.
All right. Well, Adrian, thank you. And we will go ahead.
Yes, sir. Do you mind? Sorry, if I was
Sure.
Just wanted Monica to kind of almost summarize the last two, her presentation and Adrian's, just to talk a little bit about next steps or some outcomes that we've succeeded in. Go ahead, Monica.
Absolutely.
Sure, thanks. So in the innovative mobility space this summer, we will actually be bringing a new framework for funding that the board approved for last year for our 2022 Forward program. As part of that, we'll have more information on performance outcomes. But broadly, I think one of the most recognizable projects in the innovative space at SACOG is Civic Lab. And I wanted to note that we were actually reached out to by a graduate student at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Researcher there wants to use Civic Lab as the main focus of her dissertation because she did not find many examples in the entire United States of agencies, public agencies particularly, using design thinking as part of their transportation planning process. We're really excited because we think we will get some great feedback on the process generally, but also, right, we have our own blind spots. That's the whole idea around design thinking. And I think this researcher will help us uncover our own blind spots, as will our continuous feedback loop. In our first year of Civic Lab that Adrian briefly touched on, which included the 2 autonomous vehicle demonstration projects, the board approved $1 million to implement the pilot projects. Out of that, that actually leveraged another 1.2 million in public and private funds, both in kind or hard dollars, to facilitate that. And I think we all know anytime we can bring additional dollars in, particularly from the private sector, to work with us, that's great. Other programs, and you will hear later this year at this committee as well, more about our shared services. Connor Peterson, as I mentioned, will be coming, talking more about the shared services program that really is saving money, saving time through procurement things, which again, isn't as cool sounding as an autonomous vehicle demonstration project, but when you can show that you're saving tax dollars and that you're streamlining processes, that's really exciting. One of the ways that I also like to think about when you're trying to solve problems, going right to your sources, and oftentimes that is your own staff who maybe we don't think about. They are on the ground. They're the ones close to the projects coming up with these creative solutions. So shared services, while maybe doesn't seem as exciting, is very exciting for me and for, I think, your staff. Procurement, we're pre-qualifying experts. You may recall from the last board presentation, Jennifer Hargrove talked about our pre-qualifying, and she's actually talked about it quite a bit in the last calendar year. We pre-qualified experts to help use the HCD funding, the Regional Early Action Planning for Housing money. And what we essentially did was through this housing series, pre-qualified consultants. So now there's a very easy procurement process there's no procurement process for your staff who are going to use our consultants. Essentially, they just tier off of our agreements, and that's really exciting. And then we have a series of expanded or new partnerships. We are being sought out to advise and partner with Sac State Carlson Center for Innovation, the Sacramento Growth Factory, which is a VC technology startup company in our region, the California Mobility Center, UC Davis. We're working with their ITS, their Institute for Transportation Studies, the PSE, which is the Public Scholarship and Engagement, and then the Center for Regional Change as well, many more. And it's been quite a change, and it's starting to have that shift where government can be an innovator, a partner, and a leader. So I'll stop right there.
Thanks, Monica.
Sure.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you, James. Thank you for sort of tying it together for us as well. So thank you for doing that. Okay, we will go ahead then and move on to item 5. Which is the 2021 Mega Region Working Group and upcoming board workshop. And Clint has this item for us this morning. Good morning, Clint.
Good morning. So I just wanted to give you a brief update, little recap on the working group, and then on your board meeting on the 18th, we've got a workshop that we'll introduce. So just for those of you that are either new or want a quick refresher, our Mega Region Working Group, it's a partnership that we have formed with San Joaquin Council of Governments and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the Bay Area to look at our shared economy, our shared networks across this Northern California mega region. 16 counties, nearly a quarter of the California population, well over 10 million people. This group was started, I think, around back in 2015 or so, but kind of took a short hiatus. And then last year, Director Ferrix, when he was chair, he brought this group back. And so we had 4 meetings last year. The result of those meetings, you'll see in your packet. We got a memorandum of understanding with that group for how this working group is going to function going forward, and to lend it a little more permanence and keep our activities more coordinated than they had been prior. but also Christina, even last month when she brought our legislative platform, you would have seen in our legislative platform that we now have shared principles, legislative principles with the mega region partners. One of those that was a pretty big focus last year and is something that is kind of now operationalized in our staff work is Christina this morning talking about some of that SB 375 related legislation as part of what we might want to look at as we're examining that legislation is how can we bring the long range transportation plans and our sustainable community strategies that all that are driven by SB 375, they're out of sync just in terms of timing with our partners, our neighbor MPOs. But because we have such a shared economy and a shared network, our residents go back and forth. They don't recognize necessarily the administrative boundaries that we plan within. One of the things we want to look at when SB 375 is talked about is how can we better align the timing of our long-range transportation plans so that we can have bigger and better discussions about transportation investments, infrastructure investments, programs that that we can work on with our partners. Just having the timing of those major policy discussions that each of our agencies bring before you and then the boards in the Bay Area, the board at San Joaquin, having the timing lined up will help so much with just coordinating that work. And that kind of gets to what I believe the focus is for the Mega Region Working Group in 2021, which is starting to look at our shared transportation infrastructure priorities. We have our first Mega Region Working Group coming up this month on March 26th, where we will start to talk about these issues. In advance of that first Mega Region Working Group meeting, by the way, we will have representing us on that group. Chair Gore will be there, Director Saylor, Director Frericks will continue, and then Director Kozlowski are the SACOG board members that will represent us on that group. All of the information and the discussion and any recommendations that come out of that working group will come back and feed through the Policy and Innovation Committee. So if there is any action or anything like this, this will be the recommending committee to the full SACOG board. Coming up next week on the 18th at the board meeting to start this discussion about and do some level setting about this, about kind of shared transportation priorities across the mega region. We are bringing Rob Paget, who is the managing director of the Capital Corridor JPA, and then Stacy Mortensen, who is the executive director of the Altamont Corridor Express. They will come and share some of their insights on major passenger rail connections between us and our partners within the mega region, to the Bay Area, to San Joaquin. And I believe they'll be talking about both some of the projects that they are actively working on, some business case for rail into the future. So that'll be a good discussion that we'll have at the board meeting on the 18th. So in your packet, you've got the 3 meetings that we've already scheduled for this year. I said the first one's on the 26th. You also have the memorandum of understanding that we landed on last year. And at the back of that MOU are kind of some of the example tasks or the example activities that are of interest to the group. Transportation investment, transportation infrastructure priorities are one of those things, and I believe going to be a large focus of this next year. So with that, James, I don't know if you wanted to add any insights about the workshop that is coming up, but also happy to answer any questions from the committee.
I just think the timing is great, as Clint was saying, in terms of the working group and getting our act together across Northern California for some of the state grants, but also obviously many of us are looking and hopeful at what federal action may be coming this year, perhaps on an infrastructure stimulus. So all the more reason to, and with this president and this administration putting a big emphasis on passenger rail and improvements to passenger rail, I think we need to be ready. So.
Great, thank you. Any comments, questions from committee members? I don't know, Director Ferricks, if you wanted to add anything from your perspective.
I'll just a really quick comment. I think it's important work for us to continue to engage in, but also especially after having the sort of advocacy presentation this morning, I think it's going to be increasingly important for us to sort of be collaborating with the folks in San Joaquin and the Bay Area on sort of issues that are important to the entire sort of 3 region area. I mean, I think it's and especially also I think keeping in mind just that every time any time that you have a situation where folks up here in Northern California are having to be compared to what's happening in Southern California. I don't know, there was a graphic that's been shared just recently. I don't know if folks have seen this. It's been in the media a couple different places, that if you take a line and draw it across California, it's 50% of the population in California exists essentially where Santa Clarita, if you draw the line across where Santa Clarita is, 50% of California's population beneath Santa Clarita is there, and then 50% of California's population above Santa Clarita and the Grapevine is above it. So I think anything that we can do to work collaboratively with folks in the sort of the mega region to sort of frankly serve as a counterweight to the funding issues that and other challenges we see that when it's related to Southern California is, I think, pretty important. So appreciate
Lucas,
it.
are you suggesting a mega region?
We may have to go there at some point, but that's pretty mega. I think Bay Area, San Joaquin, and Sacramento is probably good for now, but who knows?
I can tell you, as somebody that grew up in Southern California, we thought anything above Santa Barbara was Northern California, so we may need that mega region.
Growing up in Michigan, everything north of like the suburbs of Detroit, people refer to as up north. So same thing.
All right. Any other comments? Okay.
Just a teaser on that again, because I think there's a lot of folks, even in the transportation world, that don't know this, but the ACE train service is going to come north. Speaking of going north, to Sacramento, to North Sacramento, to Natomas, and a connection to the airport, and possibly beyond that, looking at a further extension to North State through Yuba City, Marysville, with a possible Chico extension. So we think about the Capitol Corridor and the third track to Roseville, and there's talk about getting further, but there's also a really interesting opportunity coming north through the valley as well. So just a teaser for your workshop and the opportunities in front of us.
Thank you, James. And Renee, do we have any public comment?
We do not have any public comment.
Okay, thank you. All right, Clint, thank you very much. And we will move on to our next item, which is our member dues and the quarterly impact report. And Eric has this presentation for us this morning.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So really tying everything together, you've heard about today, the policy and the innovation work that we're doing at SACOG. The member dues is really how we pay for a lot of that work. We are an agency that deals with all regional issues that our members bring before us, but unfortunately, the main vehicle we have for paying for our operations is through transportation funds. And I know many of you feel the pain of the restrictions on transportation funds and all the overhead involved with that. And it's no different for SACOG in paying for operations. And so while the membership dues make up an overall small portion of our overall budget, it is really important for us to be able to have these flexible funds to deal with things like Civic Lab, to have a presence at the state capitol in a way that we haven't in the past. So this is informational, but kind of continuing the spirit of the year, want to make sure we have a good grounding for our new board members of what exactly the different components are of SACOG. And this is also a bit of a preview to for some financial issues. Next month, this committee will spend some time looking at the draft budget for the next fiscal year, which starts in July, and our overall work program for that same period. We're also going to be revisiting our reserves policy and looking at the SACOG Financing Corporation, which is also something that this committee serves as, that financing corporation, and kind of what we do with the reserves that have been sitting there for some time. But back to the membership dues, this is something we've brought for a while because the board 2 years ago approved an increase in the membership dues. And so we wanted to talk about kind of what we've been doing since that dues increase took place. And so as I alluded to earlier, there's really three things that the dues help us pay for: our advocacy work, some of the technical assistance that we're able to expand to do more to help you and your cities and counties, and then the partnerships. And so Monica mentioned a couple, but particularly the economic prosperity partners, which are listed in the agenda item. The work we've been doing with those is really important, and the dues help with that. So just wanted to give you some of that background, and then I'll also highlight that when the board brought this forward in the past, they had talked about phasing it in over 3 years, but of course, due to the budgetary impacts of the pandemic, our current thinking and the way we've been building the draft budget that you'll see next month is that we would forego the dues increase starting in July and revisit that for the fiscal year that starts in July of 2022, just understanding the impacts that all of you are facing with your home budgets. So I'll pause there and see if there's any questions. But this is normally just kind of a receive and file item that we bring every quarter.
Thank you, Eric. James, I didn't know if you wanted to make any comments.
I think Eric did a great job, right? The membership dues are small but incredibly important. And honestly, for this committee, I think you get to see a lot of the work that we get to do as a result of those membership dues. As Eric mentioned, I know it's always tough to see them increase and go up. We did have an agreement 2 years ago to spread an increase over 3 years. We recognize this is a hard time to be asking for that increase. But we're also looking at, are there other creative ways that we can fund the staff work we do? We are pretty low in our takes, on our admin takes, on things like transportation funds, federal and state, and there may be other creative ways that we could approach this. So anyway, this is a report that you're going to get quarterly and is really trying to, on a quarterly basis, really sum up what's the value proposition, right? I went around a couple of years ago when we did the dues increase and almost, I think, to every jurisdiction, and it was a great chance to recheck with folks and really give people the value proposition, what your membership dues go for. So we're hoping there's value, but we're always open to the conversation on how we're using them.
Thank you, James. And I'll just, for my 2 cents, I do think it's, I get the idea of delaying a little bit of it. I don't think we should delay for too long. I'm always a big believer in, I'd rather not get like the, 8-9% increase on something because, we delayed for too many years, regardless of what it is. And then you have an even bigger fight because we didn't do sort of the CPI or something that would have made the cost less burdensome than having a big hit. And I'll also say, unlike San Francisco region and Los Angeles region, we kind of have to, I think this is hugely important for us so that we do have a seat at the table in a way that we don't have naturally like they do with the political power that comes from sort of those two bookends of the state. And so, our lobbying, the ability for us to be at the table and in the building, I think is very important to our overall region. So from my perspective, it's money well worth the investment, as we move forward here. Okay, seeing no other comments, we'll go ahead. Renee, any public comment?
We do not have any public comment.
Okay, thank you, Renee. So we'll move on to item 7, which is a receive and file, which is on our quarterly reports and contracts, unless there's any questions. Okay, seeing none. Our next meeting will be Monday, April the 5th. Any last comments from anybody? All right, seeing none. Well, thank you, everybody. I'll see you at our general board meeting, and everybody have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael. Thanks all.